1932. The Winter Olympics open in Lake Placid, New York. Amelia Earhart becomes the first female to perform a solo transatlantic flight. The Bonus Army marches on Washington, D.C. to receive their World War I benefits. The unemployment rate in the U.S. was at 33%. Among many other notable events of 1932, one of the most disturbing of that same year has been labeled as one of the most famous kidnappings of the 20th century, and also one of the greatest hoaxes ever committed. Today, we'll be going over the story of the Lindbergh kidnapping.
Kidnapping. Layer 1.
March 1st, 1932. Night had fallen in Hopewell, New Jersey. At approximately sometime between 8:30 and 10 p.m., a nurse named Betty Gow goes to check on the 20-month-old son of famous aviator Colonel Charles Lindbergh and Anne Morrow Lindbergh. But something was wrong. When the nurse checked the room, the baby was missing from his crib. The only remnant of someone having been there was a trail of muddy footprints. Their absence was immediately reported to his parents, and a search was conducted on the state's premises. Even Colonel Lindbergh partakes in it long after midnight, but to no avail. Though on the radiator that made the window seal of the nursery, a ransom note was discovered. The grammar and handwriting was rather incoherent, but it read,
Dear Sir, have $50,000 ready. $2,500 in $20 bills, $5,000 in $10 bills, and $10,000 in $5 bills. After 2 to 4 days we will inform you where to deliver the money. We warn you for making anything public or for the police. The child is in good care. Indication for all letters are signature and 3 holes.
The Hopewell police were notified, though the report was immediately telephoned to the state police, and they were to assume the investigation. At the scene of the crime, not only was mud found on the floor of the nursery room, but also a carpenter's wood chisel. A footprint was found under the window, but it was impossible to make out. No fingerprints or blood was found, but 2 sections of a makeshift ladder were found that had been used to reach the window, mud covering the rungs. One of the 2 sections had broken in the process of walking either up or down the ladder. An investigation was conducted. Household and estate workers were questioned. Police were forcing them to provide alibis. They even went so far as to question the boyfriend of the nursemaid, Betty Gow. Colonel Lindbergh agreed that the police that they had to have been very familiar with the building's layout. Colonel Lindbergh tried to communicate through his friends and make an attempt to reach the kidnappers. After widespread appeals, contact with underworld characters, and numerous clues were visited, success had yet to be found. On March 6th, a second ransom note was received by Colonel Lindbergh. It was sent 2 days prior, postmarked from Brooklyn, New York. This note threatened that I'll have to hold the baby until everything is quiet, but until then, the baby will be in good care. They raised the ransom amount to $70,000 and said they'll continue negotiating soon. A police conference was then called by the governor at Trenton, New Jersey, and various theories and policies of procedure were discussed. Private investigators also were employed by Colonel Lindbergh's attorney, Colonel Henry Breckinridge. A third ransom note was received by Breckinridge on March 8th, rejecting any intermediary the family would appoint to negotiate for the safe return of their child. Shortly thereafter, Dr. John F. Condon, a retired Bronx school principal, wrote a note to his local paper offering to act as a go-between for the Lindberghs and the kidnappers, and to contribute $1,000 of his own money if it led to Charles Jr. coming home safely. Condon's request was granted by the kidnappers via a letter sent back to the newspaper. He adopted the name Jaffe, a play on his initials, in his interactions with the kidnappers, and was told to keep the police out of the negotiations for the boys' safe return. Lindbergh approved of Condon's intervention, even if the authorities did not. On about March 10, 1932, Dr. Condon received $70,000 in cash as ransom and immediately started negotiations for payment through newspaper columns. March 12th, 8:30 p.m. After a strange phone call, a rather mysterious ransom note was delivered to Dr. Condon by a taxi driver named Joseph Perrone from an unidentified stranger. This note said the following note could be found in the disclosed location underneath the stone. As indicated prior, the note underneath the stone was found. A man who went by the name of John was to be met at the Woodlawn Cemetery. Accompanying Dr. Condon was a bodyguard, but they would not be present while talking to John. When they met, ransom money was discussed, and the stranger agreed to present evidence of the child's possession. And over the following days, Dr. Condon would urge further contact in his willingness to pay the ransom. 4 days later, on March 16th, Dr. Condon received the 7th ransom note and the baby's nightsuit in the mail to prove his identity. Charles Lindbergh confirmed it was his. Condon soon received the 8th ransom note, insisting that they comply and implying the crime had been planned for at least a whole year. A little more than a week later, on March 29th, Betty Gowd, the young boy's nurse, found his thumb guard, which he had been wearing at the time of the kidnapping, near the entrance of the estate. Only a day later, the 9th ransom note, received by Dr. Condon, threatened to raise the demands to $100,000 if they weren't met soon. Finally, on April 1st, 1932, a month after the boy had been taken, the 10th ransom note instructed Dr. Condon where to deliver the $50,000 ransom money the following night. The 11th ransom note was delivered to Condon on April 2nd, 1932, by an identified taxi driver who said he received it from an unknown man. Dr. Condon found the 12th ransom note under a stone in front of a greenhouse, as instructed in the 11th note. With Lindbergh himself having watched from afar, Condon would proceed to pass off the money to a man with a heavy German accent that the authorities and the press would call Cemetery John. After receiving the ransom money, Cemetery John gave Condon another note that provided a receipt, and the 13th note, which were instructions that the boy would be found on a boat named Nellie that was docked near Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. The stranger walked off into the night. Following that night, 2 searches for the child, including one by Lindbergh himself, would prove unsuccessful. Meanwhile, Condon gave authorities about John so police artists could create a sketch of the man. Dr. Condon was positive that he would recognize John if he ever saw him again. On May 12th, 1932, the body of the kidnapped baby was accidentally found, partially buried, and badly decomposed, about 4.5 miles southeast of the Lindbergh home, 45 feet from the highway near Mount Rose, New Jersey. The discovery was made by William Allen, an assistant on a truck driven by Orville Wilson. The head was crushed, there was a hole in the skull, and some of the body parts were missing. The body was positively identified and cremated at Trenton, New Jersey on May 13, 1932. The coroner's examination showed that the child had been dead for about 2 months, though the death was caused by a blow on the head. March 2nd, 1932. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover contacts the HQ of the New Jersey State Police and officially informs them that they would assist in the apprehension of perpetrators responsible for the kidnapping. The resources and facilities were at the disposal of the New York State Police. In the following weeks, the Bureau could only sit idly by. It wasn't until May 13, 1932, that the President directed that they dispatch all the governmental investigative agencies to the disposal of the state of New Jersey. The FBI was to help with conducting the case. May 23, 1932. The FBI informs the banks in New York that they would watch for ransom money. The state police announced 3 days later that they would offer a reward for information resulting in the apprehension and conviction of the kidnapper or kidnappers. Copies of this notice were forwarded by the FBI to all law enforcement officials and agencies across the U.S. On June 10, 1932, Violet Sharp, a waitress for Mrs. Lindbergh's mother, committed suicide after being under investigation. She swallowed poison and died, but it was confirmed that she had no connection with the abduction. In September of 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stated that all work on the case should be focused in the Department of Justice. On October 19, 1933, it was officially announced that the FBI would have exclusive jurisdiction insofar as the federal government was concerned in the handling of any investigative features of the case. The president proclaimed for the recollection of the treasury of all gold and gold certificates, which provided a valuable opportunity because as much as $40,000 of the ransom money was in gold certificates. On January 17, 1934, the New York City FBI office issued a circular letter that all banks keep their eyes out for the ransom certificates, and in February 1934, all FBI offices were supplied with a revised pamphlet containing the serial numbers of the bills used for the ransom money. The same pamphlet was sent to nearly anyone that dealt with cash, so they would be wary of who was to possess the bills. Frequent personal contacts were made with individual employees or bank officials in an effort to see if any of these bills had yet been found. All the findings of the ransom notes were reported to representatives from the FBI, New Jersey State Police, and the New York Police Department. Unfortunately, a byproduct of this case was the mass influx of misinformation from demented people, publicity seekers, and frauds. There were many attempted frauds which required extensive investigations before they could be completely eliminated from consideration in connection with the Lindbergh case. Thousands of leads were investigated in this case, everything ranging from the activities of the Purple Gang in Detroit, the attempts at locating the boat Nellie as described in Note 13, and the records of cemetery employees in New York and New Jersey. Cases with similarities or references that bore a resemblance to the Lindbergh case were examined rather thoroughly, and many pictures were shown to the witnesses of John in an attempt to positively identify him. May 2nd, 1933, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York had discovered 297 gold certificates, all of which were Lindbergh ransom notes. These bills had been made in a single deposit the day prior, and one was even found bearing the name and address of J.J. Faulkner, 537 West 149th Street. Despite investigation, this individual was never located. Further examination was conducted on the ransom notes, and it was conclusive that they were all written by the same person, and the individual was of German nationality. Dr. Condon described John as Scandinavian and spent a lot of time viewing the photographs of possible suspects and known criminals. A portrait of John was even constructed from the descriptions provided by Dr. Condon and the taxi driver, Joseph Perrone, who had delivered one of the ransom notes. A further attempt to identify John was made, and Dr. Condon transcribed in detail on phonographic records both John's pronunciations and his dialect. A lot more details about the individual was gathered with this procedure, such as his nationality, education, mentality, and character. One of the most intriguing attempts to try to identify the killer centered entirely around the examination of the ladder. The ladder was very poorly built, but built by someone who worked with wood. It was examined for fingerprints and shown to the employees of the Lindberghs. The type of wood was painstakingly analyzed by an expert named Arthur Kohler. His extensive research on not just the state of the wood, but the origin of it was summarized in a report of his, which later played a crucial role in the trial.
Arrest. Layer 2.
The case's gold certificate lead had gone quiet for 7 months. That was until a period of time from August 20th to September 1934, where a total of 16 gold certificates were discovered, mostly in the vicinity of Yorkville and Harlem. At each location that a bill was found, a corresponding pin was placed on a large map of the metropolitan area. This indicated the movements and activity of the individual in possession of the ransom money. After contacting the banks in the area, they were able to trace who had originally passed them. For the first time in the history of the case, they'd successfully found a description of the person who had been passing these bills around. This individual fit that of John, as described by Dr. Condon. These bills had been passed around in corner stores. September 18th, 1934. At about 1:20 p.m., the assistant manager of the Corn Exchange Bank and Trust Company called the New York City FBI office to tell them that one of the $10 gold certificates had been found mere minutes ago by one of the bank tellers. This bill had been received by a gas station in New York City. Only 3 days prior, an attendant alerted them of a man who had paid for gas who matched the description of John. The attendant, suspicious of the certificate, recorded the license plate number of the suspect. This vehicle was owned by one Bruno Richard Hopman, who lived in the Bronx, New York. The night of September 18th, his house was surveyed by federal and local authorities, and at 9 a.m. the following morning, a man fitting the description of John and the same person who had purchased the gas left his home and entered his vehicle. The man was quickly apprehended and taken into custody. The man who left his home was none other than Bruno Richard Hopman, the same individual in which the license had been issued to. He was a German carpenter who had lived in America for 11 years. One of the gold certificates used as ransom money was found in his belongings. He fit the description perfectly. In his home were shoes which had been purchased with a ransom note. He admitted he had other purchases with similar certificates. Later on the same day, it was confirmed by the taxi driver that delivered the ransom note to be the same individual. The next day, over $13,000 in ransom money was found within Hotman's garage. Dr. Condon confirmed that Bruno was the same individual as John. It was also evident that he owned the same vehicle that matched the description of one seen near the Lindbergh estate only a day prior to the kidnapping. Hotman's handwriting was sampled and sent to be examined in an FBI laboratory. There were also indisputable similarities between his samples and the handwriting of the ransom notes, and to no surprise, he bore a striking resemblance to the portrait constructed by the descriptions of John. Bruno Hotman, 35 years old. He was a native of Saxony, Germany. He had been previously convicted of robbery and had jail time even. In July of 1923, he tried to illegally enter the United States but was arrested and immediately deported. He tried and failed yet again in August of the same year, but in November he successfully entered the United States. On October 10th, 1925, Hotman married a New York City waitress named Anna. They had a son, Manfred, who was born to them in 1933. During his legal stay in New York City and until the spring of 1932, Hotman continued to work as a carpenter. However, shortly after March 1st, 1932, Hotman began to trade rather extensively in stocks and never chose to work again.
Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a carpenter living far up in the Bronx, had $14,000 hidden in his garage. Overnight, he became number one suspect in the sensational Lindbergh kidnap case. All the bills, some of which were cleverly hidden, as well as crudely addressed letters to the Colonel and Dr. John F. Condon, widely publicized go-betweens, are said to prove definitely that Hauptmann is guilty.
September 26, 1934. The Supreme Court charged Hotman with extortion, and 12 days later, on October 8th, he was indicted for murder. Hotman's 5-week trial began the following year, on January 3rd of 1935 in Flemington, New Jersey. The case had overwhelming circumstantial evidence. Tool marks on the ladder matched tools owned by Hotman. Wood in the ladder was found to match wood used as flooring in his attic. Dr. Condon's telephone number and address were found scrawled on a door frame inside a closet. Handwriting of the ransom notes matched samples of Hotman's handwriting. The list goes on. On February 13th, 1935, the jury returned a verdict. Hotman was guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. After an attempt for an appeal, which was denied, it was decided he would be electrocuted January 17th, 1936. But many delays caused the date to be moved to the week of March 30th. And on April 3rd, 1936, at 8:47 a.m., Bruno Richard Hotman was killed by electrocution.
Orient Express. Layer 3.
Murder on the Orient Express, written by Agatha Christie and published in 1933. Very easily, connections can be made to one of the most popular detective novels of all time, The Murder on the Orient Express. To give a brief summary of the novel, world-famous detective Hercule Poirot rides on the Orient Express, only to be required to solve yet another mystery aboard the train. A man named Ratchet gets killed, only to be discovered he himself is actually named Cassetti, the kidnapper of one Daisy Armstrong. Cassetti requested $200,000, only for the parents to find Daisy's dead body. The mother went into premature labor when hearing the news, so she and the child both died. The colonel shot himself, broken-hearted, and a nursemaid also committed suicide out of suspicion towards her. It turned out that Cassetti was murdered by none other than... Well, you can read the book to find it out yourself. But if you couldn't put together those similarities, I can line them up for you. First, think of the Armstrong baby as the Lindbergh baby. They both come from rather famous backgrounds, the fathers both being colonels. They were both kidnapped from their own homes, and both had immense ransoms paid for them, only to be found dead. Cassetti, much like Hotman, does eventually get found out and pays the price of death for the crime. One of the more interesting things I've found is how in both cases, maids of some form both had committed suicide in order to escape false persecution. The Armstrong case sounded all too tragic in the story, but all based on true events of the Lindbergh case. Realistic fiction in itself will always be binded to the structure of reality, so basing it off an actual event that happened mere months before the publishing of the book and the investigation was still ongoing when the novel was first released provided a great motive for the crime of the novel. It's been over 90 years since the events of the Lindbergh kidnapping, but the story still leaves an impact in history. The methods in finding Codman were quite impressive then, and still could be considered now.
I can only imagine the hole left in the hearts of the Lindbergh family. And after doing all this research, I also feel bad for Bruno's wife. She spent the rest of her life trying so desperately to clear the name of her husband, even up until her death in 1994. Even after his trial and execution, she had always maintained the fact that her husband had driven her from her job back to home and had stayed with her for the entire night of the kidnapping.
Thank you for watching today's video. It's been in the works for well over a week now, and I've recorded it all in Hot Attic, so I hope you enjoyed it.